What stands to be lost when the throne can no longer command the cheers of the crowd? Tears welled in Princess Catherine's eyes, and she instinctively raised a hand to cover her mouth as a chilling revelation was laid bare within the private confines of Windsor Castle. Prince William stood frozen, utterly stunned by the sheer cruelty of the truth just exposed. What lay within the blue folder held by Princess Anne? What figures or covert directives possessed the power to shake the very foundations of the British royal power structure? And why did a seemingly noble title become a source of sheer terror for those wielding power from the shadows? This was no mere family squabble or fleeting discord behind closed doors. It was the moment a massive scheme of manipulation was directly unmasked. A historic turning point, forcing the royal family to confront the precarious line between truth and the total collapse of a monarchy, standing at a critical crossroads. The weight of a single moment in royal history is rarely measured by the grandeur of the setting, but rather by the silent shifts of power that occur when no cameras are rolling. In the quiet, historic confines of Windsor Castle, far away from the adoring crowds and the flashing lenses of the national press, a private meeting had been convened under the guise of routine administrative planning. Yet, as the heavy oak doors clicked shut and the last of the junior secretaries departed, the atmosphere inside the room transformed instantly. There was no polite preamble, no gentle inquiries about health or family, and no warm diplomatic smiles. Instead, the focus shifted entirely to a heavy blue folder resting on the mahogany table in front of Princess Anne. To anyone standing outside, the gathering appeared to be nothing more than a standard operational review concerning upcoming state engagements and public itineraries. But within those walls, the unfolding reality was far more explosive than any public scandal that had ever leaked to the tabloids. It was a confrontation designed not to mend fractures, but to expose the deep, structural fault lines that had been quietly widening beneath the monarchy for months. At the center of this storm was Princess Catherine, who had arrived at the castle believing she was there to discuss appearances, duties, and the ongoing transition of the royal image following a grueling period of personal and public challenge. For months, the public had watched her step back into the spotlight with a grace and resilience that captivated millions. Every public appearance, every wave, and every gentle interaction with families lining the streets had generated an overwhelming wave of public compassion and emotional resonance. But what the public saw as a heartwarming return to service, the inner machinery of the palace viewed through a lens of profound anxiety. The central question hanging heavily in the room was not how to support the future queen, but how to contain a level of popularity that was beginning to overshadow the reigning monarch and the established hierarchy itself. The narrative that had been carefully cultivated for decades was suddenly at risk of being completely rewritten by the spontaneous, unfiltered affection of ordinary people. When Princess Anne finally closed the folder in front of her and turned her gaze toward the table, the illusion of institutional harmony shattered completely. She did not raise her voice, nor did she rely on theatrical anger. Her delivery was chillingly precise, rooted in facts, names, dates, and direct quotes gathered from multiple sources within the household staff. The revelation that followed was not merely that Queen Camilla harbored private reservations about Catherine, but that an active, systemic effort had been underway to systematically undermine Catherine's standing, diminish her public speaking time, alter her positioning at key events, and quietly rewrite briefing memos to strip away references to her future role as queen. The realization that these tactical adjustments had not been innocent logistical changes, but rather calculated moves designed to control her influence, sent a shockwave through the room. William's immediate, frozen reaction, and Catherine's visible heartbreak were the human costs of a much larger, colder institutional war, a war fought not with open hostility, but with administrative precision, subtle edits, and whispered doubts that had been circulating behind her back for months. While everyone continued to smile beside her in public, the implications of this confrontation extended far beyond the immediate emotional devastation experienced by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. It raised a fundamental, unsettling question about the nature of modern monarchy. Can an institution steeped in tradition and controlled hierarchy survive when the emotional center of gravity shifts entirely to an individual whose popularity is entirely organic? For months, staff members had whispered about the perilous popularity of Catherine, noting with growing alarm how every public engagement she undertook drew more emotional engagement than weeks of traditional state announcements from King Charles and Queen Camilla. The institutional reflex to such an imbalance was not to embrace the renewed warmth, but to construct invisible boundaries, rebalance attention, and reassert control over a narrative that was slipping away from the traditional power brokers. Every shortened speech, every relocated photo opportunity, and every altered briefing document now stood revealed as a piece of a much larger puzzle, a deliberate strategy to contain a future queen whose very existence had become too influential for the comfort of the existing power structure. As the meeting progressed, the layers of institutional denial began to peel away, exposing the uncomfortable truth about how personal animosities and strategic ambitions had successfully masked themselves as routine administrative decisions. King Charles, listening in stunned silence, was forced to confront the reality that his own approval of workload adjustments had been weaponized by advisors and family members to sideline the future of the monarchy. The defense offered by Camilla, that boundaries were necessary to protect the constitutional order and prevent emotion from ruling the institution, only served to confirm the depth of the ideological divide within the room. This was no longer a disagreement over scheduling or public relations. It was a fundamental struggle over who would hold the true moral and emotional authority of the crown in the decades to come. The silence that followed Anne's revelations was deafening, broken only by the quiet realization that the old ways of managing perception through secrecy and calculated omission were no longer viable in an era where the public's eye could pierce through the polished facade of palace life. The deeper mechanism of institutional survival often demands that warmth be measured against structural stability and ancient hierarchy. When the public lined the streets to witness the return of Catherine, their cheers were not merely expressions of goodwill. They represented a seismic shift in the emotional gravity of the entire realm. Every time a child reached out to touch her hand, and every time a camera lens captured her quiet resilience after months of profound uncertainty, the traditional power dynamic of the monarchy experienced an unprecedented tremor. The institution of the crown has always relied upon a carefully managed distribution of attention, ensuring that the reigning sovereign and the current administration remain the undisputed focal points of national life. Yet, the overwhelming wave of public compassion that accompanied Catherine back to her duties defied all administrative calculations and disrupted the rigid equilibrium that the palace had maintained for generations. Within the inner corridors of the royal household, this spontaneous adoration was not greeted with celebration, but with a quiet, pervasive anxiety that quickly morphed into defensive strategy. To the senior staff and the architects of the royal diary, an individual whose popularity outshines the core establishment poses a unique structural challenge. The monarchy is an entity built upon centuries of precedent, where every public appearance, every speech, and every placement in a photograph is weighted with constitutional significance. When public affection begins to concentrate overwhelmingly on a future queen, whose personal trials have made her deeply relatable to millions, the traditional hierarchy faces a profound dilemma. The central question that haunted the private offices of the palace was not how to amplify this renewed warmth, but rather how to contain a level of influence that threatened to eclipse the reigning power structure before the transition of the crown could even begin. This institutional reflex manifested not through sudden outbursts or dramatic public conflicts, but through a slow, methodical readjustment of administrative priorities. Secretaries and advisors began to view Catherine's rising prominence not as an asset to the crown, but as a potential vulnerability that needed careful management. The sheer volume of emotional resonance she generated was interpreted by the traditional power brokers as a disruptive force capable of distorting the carefully calibrated balance between the various royal households. Consequently, decisions regarding her schedule began to undergo subtle transformations. Engagements were quietly modified. Speaking slots were pruned down under the guise of health and workload concerns, and strategic briefing documents began to circulate with explicit recommendations to rebalance public attention away from the Wales household. Every single adjustment was defended as a logical precaution designed to protect her well-being. Yet, behind closed doors, the underlying motivation was entirely focused on the containment of her growing authority. The friction between institutional self-preservation and organic public affection created an atmosphere of pervasive uncertainty within the palace walls. Staff members who had served the crown for decades found themselves caught between the official narrative of harmonious family duty and the unmistakable reality of a quiet turf war over visibility and public narrative. The traditional mechanisms of royal public relations were suddenly ill-equipped to handle a situation where genuine human sympathy was generating a brand of authority that could not be legislated, appointed, or easily controlled. Every public appearance became a high-stakes diplomatic exercise, where a warm smile from Catherine carried the weight of a constitutional challenge. As these administrative edits accumulated over the months, they ceased to be mere logistical inconveniences and instead formed a clear, undeniable pattern of institutional pushback. The palace was attempting to engineer a controlled environment where the future of the monarchy could be safely managed. But in doing so, they had underestimated the depth of the public connection that bound the people to the future queen. The realization that this administrative caution had evolved into active containment was precisely what made the unfolding confrontation at Windsor Castle so explosive. It exposed the fundamental tension of modern monarchy, where the survival of an ancient institution depends upon the love of the people, yet the internal machinery of that same institution often fears the very popularity that sustains it. When the protective veneer of administrative jargon was stripped away, what remained was a stark battle over who would ultimately hold the moral and emotional leadership of the crown. The palace administrators had calculated that small, incremental reductions in visibility would gradually normalize a diminished public profile for Catherine, allowing the existing power structure to retain its absolute dominance. However, they failed to account for the unwavering loyalty of Prince William and the sharp, uncompromising eye of Princess Anne, who recognized that an attack on Catherine's prominence was, in reality, an attack on the integrity of the future reign. The quiet adjustments of the diary were no longer hidden in the shadows. They were now laid bare upon the mahogany table, forcing the entire royal family to confront the uncomfortable truth about the price of power behind the closed doors of the monarchy. The systematic unraveling of administrative pretexts began the moment Princess Anne opened the blue folder and laid out the tangible evidence of interference. For months, the subtle alterations to public schedules had been dismissed as mere coincidences or necessary accommodations for health and recovery. However, when viewed as a collective body of evidence, these adjustments revealed an undeniable pattern of calculated containment. Speaking slots at major national events had been systematically shortened, not because of time constraints, but to limit the duration of public connection. Positioning within official photographs had been subtly shifted away from the center, placing distance between Catherine and the reigning sovereign. Most tellingly, internal briefing memoranda had begun to substitute her rightful title as the future queen with generalized references to senior family members, stripping away the linguistic symbols of her impending reign. These changes were executed with such bureaucratic precision that they could easily be defended individually, yet together they painted a vivid picture of an orchestrated effort to diminish her visibility. The architects of these modifications believed they were operating within a safe zone of plausible deniability, assuming that incremental changes would permanently normalize a reduced public profile without provoking open resistance. Yet they miscalculated the vigilance of those who understood the true mechanics of the institution. Princess Anne had spent decades observing the delicate balance of power within the royal household, and she recognized the distinct fingerprints of institutional manipulation long before she confronted the perpetrators. Every edited document and every delayed itinerary served as proof that the palace machinery was actively working to manage a popularity it could not comprehend or control. The exposure of these tactical maneuvers dismantled the comforting illusion of institutional harmony, forcing everyone at the table to confront the reality that personal anxieties had successfully hijacked official protocol. As the pages were turned, the distinction between genuine concern for well-being and strategic containment dissolved completely, leaving the architects of the policy without a place to hide behind their carefully chosen administrative jargon. The sudden collapse of administrative defenses reached its absolute peak when Princess Anne confronted Queen Camilla directly about the true nature of the remarks that had been circulating through the private corridors of the palace. The careful veneer of health concerns and workload management was instantly stripped away, revealing a much darker ideological motivation rooted in pure territorial anxiety. When pressed on whether her statements had characterized Catherine as too delicate for her role, Camilla attempted to retreat behind the defensive wall of institutional necessity, arguing that someone had to voice the uncomfortable truths about a monarchy under pressure. She contended that public sentiment was dangerously outstripping customary responsibilities, and that rigorous boundaries were required to protect the constitutional order from being swept away by unbridled emotional fervor. However, Princess Anne refused to let the argument hide behind vague abstractions, pointing out that expressing legitimate worry about health is entirely different from treating a future queen as a political threat that must be actively contained. The confrontation laid bare the profound ideological fracture within the royal family, transforming a private dispute into an open ideological war over who holds the moral authority of the crown. King Charles listened in stunned disbelief as the vocabulary of rivalry replaced the language of administrative planning, realizing with sudden horror that his own approval of schedule adjustments had been weaponized to serve a hidden agenda. Prince William stepped forward, his cold fury cutting through the remaining tension in the room as he demanded to know who had authorized the systematic distortion of truth and the deliberate filtering of information sent up to the throne. The absolute silence that followed served as a crushing admission of guilt, proving that the boundaries had not been set to safeguard the institution, but to suppress a rising power that threatened to eclipse the old guard long before the official transition of the crown could take place. Every attempt by Camilla to justify her actions as a defense of the traditional hierarchy only served to deepen the divide, cementing the reality that personal animosity had successfully hijacked the official machinery of the state. The illusion of a united front was shattered beyond repair, leaving the core leadership of the monarchy to face the devastating consequences of a plot that had been exposed in full daylight. The ultimate psychological weapon in this quiet royal war was unveiled when the conversation shifted from current operational constraints to the eternal, haunting specter of the past. When all other arguments regarding health, workload, and constitutional balance had been systematically dismantled by Princess Anne, the final, most devastating assertion was brought to light. The accusation that Catherine was merely living in the borrowed shadow of Diana was not introduced as a casual observation or a historical comparison. It was deployed as a deliberate psychological lever, designed to strip away the authenticity of Catherine's connection with the British public. For years, Catherine had endured the inevitable comparisons to the late princess with grace and quiet dignity, treating them as a cross to bear within the relentless public spotlight. Yet, weaponizing that comparison inside a closed room at Windsor Castle served a far more insidious purpose. It was an explicit attempt to declare that the overwhelming wave of love, empathy, and devotion directed toward Catherine did not actually belong to her at all. The underlying narrative pushed by those who sought to contain her influence was that her popularity was ephemeral, unearned, and entirely dependent upon the public collective memory of a woman who had passed away decades prior. This narrative suggested that the crowds cheering in the streets were not seeing Catherine for who she was, but were instead projecting an idealized ghost onto her shoulders, making her triumph appear as a temporary phenomenon that the palace could eventually manage, outlast, and dissolve when the time was right. Prince William stood motionless as these words were repeated, his gaze fixed on the person across the table with a cold, settled fury that defied any impulsive outburst. The revelation that someone within the inner circle had dared to use Diana's memory as a tool of suppression crossed a sacred line from which there could be no diplomatic retreat. It laid bare the absolute cynicism of the opposition, proving that they were willing to weaponize the deepest traumas of the family's history just to protect their own fragile grip on institutional authority. The silence that gripped the room was heavy, filled with the crushing realization that every public cheer, every bouquet of flowers, and every headline praising Catherine's resilience had been quietly discounted behind closed doors as a borrowed illusion. Catherine herself felt the devastating impact of this final blow, recognizing that the cruelty of the remark lay not just in its falsehood, but in its intent to delegitimize her entire life of service and her genuine bond with the people. The argument that her public authority was merely temporary and borrowed was a direct attack on her future role as queen, designed to make her feel like an interloper in her own home and an outsider in the institution she had spent decades preparing to lead. Yet, rather than breaking her spirit, the exposure of this ultimate manipulation changed something fundamental within her demeanor. The tears that welled in her eyes were replaced by a profound clarity, an unshakable realization that the opposition she faced was not rooted in a desire to protect the monarchy, but in a deep-seated terror of her growing moral and emotional strength. As King Charles demanded an explanation and found only silence in response, the true dynamic of the power struggle was permanently altered. The invocation of Diana's name did not diminish Catherine. Instead, it exposed the utter bankruptcy of the arguments used against her, marking the definitive moment when the old guard's psychological defenses completely collapsed under the weight of their own cynicism. The final resolution of the confrontation at Windsor Castle did not arrive with a dramatic explosion of theatrical anger, but with the cold, unyielding weight of structural accountability. As the heavy silence settled over the mahogany table, King Charles was forced to acknowledge that the administrative framework of the monarchy could no longer function as a shield for personal vendettas and covert political maneuvering. The evidence laid out by Princess Anne left no room for ambiguity or diplomatic evasion, proving that the deliberate alteration of schedules, the strategic pruning of speaking times, and the weaponization of historical ghosts were systemic efforts to contain a future queen whose organic popularity had terrified the traditional power brokers. With a heavy, deliberate motion, the king closed the blue folder containing the proposed ceremonial reordering and issued a definitive mandate that permanently altered the internal governance of the royal household. From that moment forward, any adjustments concerning Catherine, her public appearances, her ceremonial prominence, or her workload would require the direct and uncompromised consultation of the Wales household. No longer would administrative jargon be permitted to disguise personal animosity, and no longer would staff members be allowed to execute unapproved edits designed to diminish her institutional standing. The days of silent compliance and hidden memos were over, replaced by a rigid boundary that demanded absolute transparency between the offices of the crown. When Prince William and Catherine stood up together to leave the room, their departure carried the quiet dignity of a victory won, not through aggression, but through unassailable truth. They did not pause to exchange parting remarks with those who had schemed against them. Instead, a brief, silent nod exchange between Catherine and Princess Anne served as the ultimate acknowledgement of an alliance forged in the crucible of institutional betrayal. Outside those doors, the public facade of the monarchy would immediately resume its familiar rhythm, presenting an image of unbroken stability, seamless unity, and traditional grace to the millions watching from afar. Crowds would continue to line the streets, cameras would capture every smile, and the daily machinery of state engagements would proceed as though nothing had ever disturbed the surface of royal life. Yet behind the polished veneer, everything had fundamentally shifted. The illusion of absolute institutional control was shattered forever, leaving the architects of the containment strategy to realize that the emotional heart of the monarchy could no longer be manipulated, sidelined, or silenced by whispered doubts in private parlors. King Charles stood alone for a moment, staring at the closed door, grappling with the harsh reality that preserving the crown required more than just managing appearances. It demanded honesty, integrity, and the courage to protect those who truly held the devotion of the people. For Catherine, the ordeal brought a profound and permanent clarity, transforming the pain of betrayal into an unshakable awareness of her own enduring strength. She walked out of Windsor Castle not as a vulnerable figure waiting for permission to lead, but as the undeniable future of the institution, armed with the absolute certainty that the love she shared with the public was authentic, earned, and entirely her own.